One thing is abundantly clear within the first several minutes of the last spells tutorial stage. This game is trying to do a lot. It's a Frankenstein monster of genre mashups that, in the first hour, so overwhelms the player with information and systems that as somebody not especially well versed in complex RPGs, I might have bounced off of it and given up. But major credit goes to its tutorial, which necessarily treated me like a child in a grocery store whose hand needed to be held lest I end up in the lobster tank, and made the game's various complexities seem second nature before long. The last spell is an engrossing hybrid of a tactical turn-based RPG, roguelite, tower defense, and, if we're being comprehensive, base builder. If thrown together haphazardly, a game with so many features threatens to become the gaming equivalent of a stack of children masquerading as a very tall adult in a trench coat. But while there's a relatively high difficulty curve and the pacing occasionally struggles, the way its systems seamlessly feed into one another is a masterful achievement in game design. At first glance, the last spell's story could be mistaken for generic post-apocalyptic fantasy, but the bits of narrative included are actually pretty interesting. In a setup analogous to a magic-based nuclear holocaust, you learn that most of civilization has been wiped out by a form of magic capable of leveling entire cities. In its wake, a strange purple mist has settled on the land with legions of mutants emerging from it at night. You command a group of heroes guarding one of the last havens of humankind, which, at its center, holds mages attempting to cast the last spell, humanity's only hope of banishing all magic from the world and bringing some hope for their future. It's a doozy of a setup and is brought to life by some gorgeous pixel art that brings plenty of color and variety to a visual premise usually laden with drab gray ruins. The 5 major havens of the last spell have a reasonable visual variety to them, and when in combat, the punchy effects that come alive with each attack are incredibly satisfying and make each weapon and scroll feel distinct. These attacks are helped by some really great sound design too. Every area of attack feels so crunchy and satisfying. The soundtrack is mostly great too, even if some of the more heavy metal tunes didn't really jive with me as much as the softer, more melodic ones. Performance-wise, the last spell is mostly quite good, but occasionally demanding. While my 1080 Ti was mostly giving me between 80 and 100 frames per second, there were times when zooming out over my settlement that it would drop dramatically to 60 or a bit lower. Similarly, you are not going to get a stable 60 FPS playing on the Steam Deck, but I found that locking it to 50 FPS or lower via Steam's overlay tools granted a smoother and perfectly acceptable experience. I may be a nerdy little drill sergeant when it comes to frame rate in games, but even I can't argue that this sort of performance in a turn-based game impacts the experience at all with how much is often happening on screen. Overall, while the game feels really well suited for the Steam Deck, I currently have a hard time recommending it for the platform. While controller mappings are mostly very thoughtful and intuitive, support on the deck is currently on the buggy side. On dozens upon dozens of occasions, the cursor letting me browse my settlement would freeze up and not let me use the thumbstick or trackpads to select anything. After some frustration, I managed to reliably unfreeze it by tapping the touchscreen, and things function normally from there, at least until the last few days when the game didn't seem to recognize touch input anymore, and I was stuck restarting the game anytime this bug happened. If it gets fixed, then this will be a great game to play on the deck, but it needs some patching before I can personally recommend it in that format. As I mentioned, the last spell is tackling a lot of genres, but the way its gameplay loop works keeps things organized and prevents any pieces from flying off the board, so to speak. You start out by picking one of your unlocked havens and whatever difficulty modifiers you want to apply to them. These come in 2 forms. One is omens, which are buffs that allow you to power up your characters, start with an initial pool of spendable resources, or make your preferred item drops more frequent. These function as customizable difficulty modifiers, and in my opinion, leaving them all off is akin to what one might expect from a very hard mode. While you do have limited slots to equip helpful omens, there's a feature called boundless mode that allows you to override this limit to select however many you want. Additionally, there are 6 levels of Apocalypse for each settlement, which add difficulty modifiers like increased enemy health or making resources cost more. The first Apocalypse level unlocks when you successfully defend a settlement and defeat its final boss, with the rest unlocking consecutively as you finish each one. Any roguelite fans will be instantly familiar with this sort of endgame progression, and those up for the challenge will find plenty of reason to come back for it. I love how scalable this game's difficulty is, and while I tried to do a couple of runs without any omens equipped, I found that equipping a limited number of them was the right level of challenge for me personally. Once you're all set up, the game plops you into a haven with a figurative spank on the ass telling you where enemies will be spawning that evening and that it's time to whip your heroes into position. Heroes are your primary method of beating back the onslaught of mutants, and you'll have 3 randomly generated ones at a time, though more can be unlocked in the production phase, which I'll get to shortly. These heroes are generated with random names, personalities, buffs, and debuffs, and it's up to you to view their profile in the character sheet menu and decide how to best use them to create powerful synergies. Combat is turn-based, with each hero's turn giving them the ability to move a limited distance and use attacks or buffs subject to a pool of action points and mana. Tactical RPG fans will feel in good hands here, especially because by default the game is not easy at all. Each night's wave of enemies gets progressively tougher, and before long the sheer number of them will overwhelm without well-placed defenses, well-leveled characters, and a strong investment into area of effect attacks that control the crowd. If you manage to survive the night, next up is the production phase. This is where you level up your heroes, choose unique perks to assist them in combat, spend any tainted essence, which functions as currency for permanent unlockables that persist between runs, build defenses, buy new equipment for your heroes, build structures in your settlement that'll do things like farm gold, boost mana, recruit new heroes, utilize existing settlement workers in the most efficient way possible, and generally just plan out how you're going to survive the next night. If this sounds like an enormous number of things to do, well, that's because it is an enormous number of things to do. Nearly everything in the last spell can, and frankly should, be micromanaged if you plan to survive. Don't take my tone as bitterness though. Each tactical decision has impacts that reverberate throughout your run, and I loved that. Sure, if you make enough wrong decisions you'll die, but it will feel like your fault and you'll come away with the knowledge to do better next time. Frankly, with the amount you can manage and see and unlock and equip in the last spell, I'm amazed at how well it all comes together. Steam Deck control issues aside, this game is a well-polished and complete package that has tons of depth. And with that comes my main caveat with the last spell, and frankly, it's a mild one. Like any good roguelite, this game is hard, and you will absolutely fail before you succeed. But while most roguelites keep individual runs short, often half an hour to an hour, the pace here is slow, deliberate, and full of decisions you will want to take your time making until you get into a groove with it. The result is that each run of a haven typically lasts 3 to 5 hours, a lot of which is spent micromanaging your hero's inventory, carefully placing settlement buildings and defenses, or cycling through each hero's moveset to figure out the best combination of attacks to take out the latest horde. Thankfully, you can save and quit at any time during a run, meaning it's plenty feasible to play the game in short bursts rather than several hour marathons. But overall, those looking for a value are in for a treat, because you can spend dozens upon dozens of hours with the last spell and still not see everything it has to offer. On the flip side, defeat can feel crushing and exceptionally discouraging for those who want the micromanagement but not the roguelite permadeath. I'm a big fan of roguelites, so to me, dying and retrying felt more like an opportunity and less of a demoralization. The last spell's progression between runs feel tangible, such as unlocking powerful versions of the aforementioned omens or being able to construct new types of buildings, and equipment varies enough to avoid tedium. But even though its gameplay loop felt compelling and beautifully designed, there were times a few hours into a run where the pace began to feel a bit sluggish. Because of this, I wasn't always in the mood to play the last spell, and yet, if I saved and walked away for a few hours, the game would live in my head rent-free until I came back for another run, so take that as you will. The core of the last spell is a tactical RPG, and I'd argue that it treats the genre with exceptional respect and ingenuity. Even if you're hesitant about its roguelite, tower defense, or base building elements, I would argue that their inclusion serves only to enhance the game and usually not detract from it. In a day and age where many AAA games add meaningless loot, cumbersome mechanics, and bloated quest objectives to add the illusion of depth, it's refreshing to see an indie that merges multiple genres in a way that's not only clever but surprisingly approachable, with none of it feeling excessive or convoluted just for the sake of it. The Last Spell is a special title, and one that I hope gets the attention it ultimately deserves, but for now, I'm just happy to grant it my first golden indie of 2023.